All right, today's lesson is going to focus on what's going on at the United States home front during World War II. So we're going to talk about this concept, this idea of World War II being a total war. So it's not just the fighting being done by the Army, the Navy, the Marines. It's what's going on at the home front too. What are American citizens doing to help in the war effort? Some of this we've already talked about during World War I, so a lot of those themes about total war and American citizens' efforts, contributions to the war will be pretty similar in the same thing. So we're basically going from the neutrality acts prior to the war to now declaring war after Japan had attacked us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So how do we train? What do we do? How do we actually mobilize and train for war? We've had the Selective Training and Service Act prior to Pearl Harbor, so we've been slowly, steadily increasing the size of our standing army for a while now. And then after Pearl Harbor, we see 15 million more Americans enter military either as volunteers on their own or we draft them, conscription. And it consists of 8 weeks of basic training. They show you how to use a rifle. They run you through some calisthenics. They try to get you in shape. Women's roles are going to start to increase both in the military and in industrial opportunities as well. So women are going to start to see more active roles in the war. They're not going to do combat missions or anything, but they will play pivotal roles as nurses, working on bases. Some of them actually flew planes, like cargo planes, but they wouldn't do like fighter planes, stuff like that. But women are seeing a definite increase in the roles both at home and in the actual war itself. Okay, so much like in World War I, we need to transition our economy again from peacetime production to wartime production. So again, the National War Labor Board, they're going to settle disputes. They're going to deal with issues of workers' rights and making sure that they're getting paid and compensated for the hours of labor they're putting in and towards the war efforts. You're going to have the War Production Board, which is going to oversee the transition again from the peacetime production to wartime production. So we're used to make a car, now you're going to make tanks. We're used to make hubcaps, now you're going to make helmets, that sort of thing. So War Production Board, National War Labor Board, they come into effect again in terms of transitioning our economy from making peacetime goods to wartime goods. And again, women's roles are going to increase dramatically when the men, like we said, we got 15 million men now leaving the workforce and entering the war. Women pick up the slack and pick up those jobs in the industrial sector and other businesses. So women doing a lot to gain equal rights and gain an equal role in American society. So how are we going to fund this war? Where does the money come from? Again, just like in World War I, we had these liberty bonds, these war bonds. These were government-backed securities that essentially guaranteed the investor, us the citizens, if we bought this bond from the government, it would mature, like you'd have to hang on to it for maybe 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And after that set time frame, the government would then have to buy it back from you with some interest gained on it. So if you paid $100 for this bond at the time of the war, 1942, 10 years later, now that bond could be worth, let's say, $500, so you've made a $400 investment on that. So it works out great for us, the citizens. It's a long-term investment that'll pay off down the road, and it's great for the U.S. government because it puts cash immediately in their hands so they can build more tanks, build more guns and rifles, and supply our troops and all that sort of stuff that they need to do for the war effort. The other thing that the federal government does is it creates the Revenue Act of 1942. It's going to raise taxes on businesses throughout the country, and it's also going to require that American citizens pay an income tax. So on the money that we make from our jobs, there will be a certain tax that the government automatically takes out. These are going to help dramatically pay for the war. In this picture here, we see a comic with Superman and Batman and Robin trying to promote the idea of the sale of bonds and also stamps. So these government-sanctioned stamps that would be used to fund the war. They would use other sorts of propaganda to promote the sale of these war bonds. Again, we talked about propaganda, the dramatic use of imagery, kind of tugging at your heartstrings and emotions to try and convince you to participate and do your part in funding and helping fund the war. This one here, the heroic soldier, let's all fight. You know, if I can't go in like this soldier here, I can at least buy war bonds. And this picture here, oh my gosh, you don't want your kid growing up and being part of Adolf Hitler's Nazi party or Hitler's Germany, so let's buy war bonds before it's too late for poor little Billy here, or whatever his name is. Again, this is all an effort to try and convince Americans to do whatever they can to help out. Other efforts to help in the war: conservation and rationing. So scrap metal, scrap rubber, tin, glass, anything and everything that we would normally throw out. There's these massive drives to collect all of this scrap junk that can be recycled and used to make, well, in this case, in this picture here, we've got these recycled tomato cans that are going to be used to make bullets for this machine gun. So this was a huge thing throughout the whole country. These rationing and these scrap metal drives, things like that. We also talked before about victory gardens. Hey, let's conserve the amount of food that we're eating, consuming. Let's ship it overseas. And in the meantime, why don't you just grow your own garden? And that way we can supply your own food needs and we can send more to our soldiers. And then we had the Office of War Information. You're the ones creating these propaganda posters, trying to convince the public, to support the war through war bonds and victory gardens, and informing the public as well as what's going on with U.S. war efforts. So when it comes to rationing, the government would issue these booklets, and inside these booklets would have these stamps. You would show up to the let's say you're going to the meat market, and you would purchase your ration of meat for the week. You would put the stamp, the guy at the meat store would put the stamp in your booklet, signifying that yes, the amount of meat that you've purchased this week, you are maximized at your limit. You can't purchase any more meat. It was a way for the government to sort of oversee how much food people were consuming. So, things like coffee, things like sugar, tea, any sort of food items that the government deemed necessary for providing for the war effort, they would issue these ration booklets. Again, here's a photograph of one of the scrap metal drives. They were pretty popular amongst Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, any sort of community efforts. Children could just collect junk and scrap and bring it to the government-sanctioned depot stations where they would collect it and ship it off and melt it all down and to make into steel, and then make it into tanks and whatever else they needed. So these were quite common and quite popular, and it was a real easy way for Americans and citizens and younger adults as well to sort of participate in the war. Here's a great picture. These kids have went around town and collected all this scrap junk and brought it to their local station, and they're pretty proud of themselves. And again, the victory gardens, more propaganda, more posters promoting the idea of, grow your own gardens. It'll help save and conserve food items we can use for the war effort. And then again, more war production, propaganda, just kind of promoting the idea that women can do it. We can help in the war effort. We're all in this together. You've probably seen this poster in my classroom. It's a great poster. It really sums up the message that, women are strong and women are equal and women can do just as much as the men, if not more. So again, all these efforts, this total war effort, it's not just the men fighting the war, it's everyone at home, it's conservation, scrap metaling, and participating and filling the void in industry. Other groups of people affected or their impacted people in World War II, African Americans were starting to see some progressive change. Pre-1942, we still had segregated units, so black unit, white unit, keep them segregated. But post-1942, we started to see the units started to be trained together. And one particular unit is the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Division in the Air Force. They would essentially were an all-black fighter pilot unit, and one of the more prestigious and prominent units too. They had a really good track record. At first they started out with real basic missions of just real easy missions, but then they became more famous for their really excellent pilots and their ability to conduct their missions and dogfighting, which is plane versus plane in the air. They became really skilled, really famous group. And there's a couple movies based on the 332nd Fighter Squadron. One is a little more current. It's called Red Tails. And the older one is the Tuskegee Airmen. I actually think this one's the better one, though. It's a little more factual, a little more historically accurate. This one's a little more glorified and more Hollywooded up. But they're both pretty good and do a really good job of kind of explaining the nature of the Tuskegee Airmen and their accomplishments, and promoting what they've done and helped for U.S. World War II efforts. Now, a not so bright part of U.S. history is what we do to Japanese Americans during World War II. You get some politicians and you get some citizens on the West Coast where there's a large contingency of Japanese immigrants who have settled, who are starting to freak out a little bit about the potential of, well, what if Japan decides to continue their way across the Pacific and actually invade the United States? And what if those Japanese Americans decide that they're going to sort of commit treason and go against the United States and side with Japan again? Well, that's kind of illogical, but that was the fear. Again, racism and prejudice sort of builds in here. We're talking about Japanese American citizens. American citizens. In many cases, a lot of these Japanese Americans were actually born in America. They just have Japanese ancestry. So what we did out of fear that the Japanese Americans might side with Japan in an invasion was that we relocated about 110,000 Japanese Americans. We take them off of the West Coast, all the states along the West Coast, and we relocate them throughout some of the western states like Colorado and parts of Arizona, and then even as far as east as Arkansas. And the removal of the Japanese Americans actually makes its way to the Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus United States in 1944, and the Supreme Court upholds that these internment camps are justified in national security interest. Because of this imminent threat of a Japanese invasion, this allows the U.S. government to basically relocate Japanese Americans in these internment camps. Now, it's important to point out that these internment camps are not the same thing as World War II Nazi Germany concentration camps. These are not death camps. We are not killing Japanese American citizens. We are simply relocating them. And again, the prejudice and the racism is certainly evident and certainly a real big motivating factor in moving these people. And a lot of people on the West Coast who were, putting these signs on their house, and people were really on board with the removal of Japanese Americans. Pretty sad. This map here kind of shows you, again, this area shaded in red. These are the western states from where all the Japanese Americans were removed and relocated to these areas in the stars here. So through Idaho, Utah, Arizona. Some were within the removal area itself, but most of them were moved further out east. And these camps, I mean, you're literally being removed from your home and forced into like these giant, long dormitory-style camps. There's no walls in between. You just kind of put up a sheet in between you and your neighbor, and that's about it that you have for privacy. Many people lost their homes. They lost their jobs. If you owned a business, too bad. You lost that business as a Japanese American, and you were now forced to live in these internment camps. Again, the imagery of it looks almost like a concentration camp with the barbed wire fence and everything. However, again, I've got to reiterate and point out, these are not the same thing as concentration camps. We are not killing these people. However, very militarized. You do have watchtowers, guys with rifles, machine guns, trying to prevent Japanese Americans from breaking out. It's kind of really scary stuff. All right, so to recap. War Production Board, War Labor Boards, transitioning from peacetime economy to wartime economy. How do we pay for this? We got to increase taxes. We got to sell war bonds again. Conservation, wheatless Wednesdays, meatless Mondays, or whatever. Try and grow victory gardens. Scrap metal drives, any sort of scrap material, recycle anything you can, rubber, tin, glass, do whatever we can to help out the total war effort. And of course, the atrocities of the Japanese American internment camps. Unfortunately, this is kind of a not so good point in American history. This is not a good thing that we did here. But hey, it is what it is. We have to learn about it. We got to make sure that we're aware of, America's shortcomings as well as the good things that we do too. So, all right, next we'll talk about the war itself and how the United States helps kind of turn the tide, and how eventually we defeat Hitler in Europe first, and then we transition into defeating the Japanese in the Pacific.